The carriage rattled to a stop outside the iron gates of Ravenhold, and Elena Whitmore's hands trembled in her lap. She had not slept the night before. She had not eaten that morning. Her father had told her only an hour before the ceremony that the man waiting for her inside those gates was a stranger who did not want a wife, and yet in 3 days she would belong to him forever. The gates groaned open. Rain had fallen the night before, and the long gravel path leading to the great stone house was still dark and wet. Elena pressed her gloved hand against the window and watched the house grow larger as the carriage moved forward. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress, tall and gray, with narrow windows that seemed to watch her back. "You must not disgrace this family," her father had said before she left. He did not look at her when he spoke. He had not looked at her properly in weeks, not since the letters from the Duke's estate had begun arriving, not since the debts had grown too large to hide. Elena understood, even if she did not want to. Her father owed more money than he could ever repay, and the Duke's steward had offered a way out. A marriage, her hand for the silence of every creditor in the county. She had begged, at first. She had cried in her room where no one could hear her, and when that failed, she had gone quiet, the way a person goes quiet when they understand that begging changes nothing. By the time she stepped into the carriage that would carry her to Ravenhold, she had already buried her protests somewhere deep, somewhere she hoped she would not have to visit again. The carriage stopped fully now, and a footman opened the door. Cold air rushed in, carrying the smell of wet earth and old stone. Elena stepped down, her legs stiff from the long journey, and looked up at the house that would be her prison, or her home. She did not yet know which. A woman met her at the door. She was older, dressed plainly but well, with gray hair pulled back tightly, and eyes that studied Elena the way a merchant studies a piece of cloth before deciding its worth. "You are Miss Whitmore," the woman said. It was not a question. "I am," Elena answered, straightening her back the way her mother had taught her, years ago, before her mother had died and left her alone with a father who cared more for his card games than for his daughter's future. "I am Mrs. Ellery, the housekeeper here." The woman's voice was clipped, careful. "His Grace is not receiving visitors today. You will be shown to your rooms, and the wedding will take place tomorrow morning, as arranged." Elena blinked. "I will not see him before the wedding?" "His Grace does not receive many people at all," Mrs. Ellery said, and something in her tone made Elena look at her more closely. There was no cruelty in the housekeeper's face, but there was caution, as if she were choosing her words, the way one might step carefully across ice. "It is not my place to explain more than that. Come, you must be tired from your journey." Elena followed her inside, through halls that smelled of beeswax polish and something colder underneath it, something like neglect. The portraits on the walls were covered in a fine layer of dust, and more than one door they passed was shut tight, as though whole sections of the house had simply been forgotten. Her room, when she reached it, was large and handsomely furnished, though it too carried that same sense of having been unused for a very long time. A fire had been lit in the hearth, and a young maid was already unpacking Elena's small trunk with quick, nervous hands. "This is Clara," Mrs. Ellery said. "She will attend to you." The maid curtsied quickly, her eyes darting to Elena's face, and then away again, as though she were afraid to look too long. Elena had the strange feeling that everyone in this house had learned to keep their eyes down, to speak softly, to move without making a sound. It was not the feeling of a home. It was the feeling of a house holding its breath. "Thank you, Clara," Elena said gently, hoping to ease some of the tension in the room. The maid gave a small, surprised smile, as though kindness were something rare within these walls. When Mrs. Ellery had gone, Elena sat by the window and looked out over the grounds. Below her, a garden stretched out, though calling it a garden was generous. The hedges had grown wild and shapeless. The flower beds were choked with weeds. Only near the edges, close to the stone wall, did a few stubborn roses still bloom, as though refusing to give up entirely. "Clara," Elena said, without turning from the window, "how long has the garden looked like this?" The maid hesitated. "Since the accident, miss. 2 years now." Elena turned. "What accident?" Clara's face went pale, and she busied herself folding a shawl that did not need folding. "It is not my place to speak of it, miss. Truly, it isn't." "Please," Elena said, "I am to be his wife tomorrow. Surely I have some right to know what happened in this house." The maid glanced at the door, as if checking that no one stood outside it, and then lowered her voice. there was a carriage. His Grace and her Grace, the first Duchess, were returning from a dinner in the city. The road was icy. The carriage went into a ravine. She paused, twisting the shawl in her hands. Her Grace did not survive. His Grace did, but she trailed off, unwilling or unable to finish. But what? Elena pressed gently. He cannot walk, miss. Not since that night. The doctors say his legs were crushed beneath the wreckage, and though the bones healed, something in him did not. He has not left this house in 2 years. He has not, from what I hear, left his own wing of it in nearly as long. Elena sat very still, absorbing this. She had known, vaguely, that the Duke was said to be reclusive, that the Tun whispered about him being cold and strange, but she had imagined coldness born of arrogance, not grief. This was different. This was a man buried alive inside his own home, and tomorrow she would be buried there with him. Does he ever speak of her, the first Duchess? Clara shook her head quickly. No one speaks of her Grace Margaret in this house, not since the funeral. It is as though her name itself is forbidden. She glanced toward the door again. You should not ask such things of the other staff, miss. Mrs. Ellery would not like it. Elena nodded slowly, though her mind was already turning over everything she had heard. She thought of the covered portraits in the hall, the shut doors, the wild garden. This house was not simply quiet. It was a house in mourning, frozen in the moment of a tragedy that no one had been permitted to move past. That night, sleep did not come easily. Elena lay awake in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the wind press against the windows, and found herself thinking not of her own fear, but of the man down the hall whom she had never even seen. What kind of person survives such a thing, and chooses, day after day, to stay locked away from the world? She woke before dawn, to the sound of rain returning. Clara arrived early to help her dress, and within a few hours, Elena found herself standing in the small private chapel attached to the house, wearing a pale gray gown that had been made for her without her ever being properly measured, sent ahead by the Duke's household with instructions that it simply be altered to fit. The chapel was cold and mostly empty. Her father stood to one side, looking uncomfortable in his best coat, avoiding her eyes, just as he had for weeks. A clergyman stood at the front, his prayer book open, and beside him stood a wheeled chair, and in it, a man. Elena's breath caught. She did not know what she had expected. Perhaps some frail, broken figure, hollowed out by tragedy. But the man in the chair was nothing of the sort. He was younger than she had imagined, with dark hair swept back from a sharp, handsome face, and eyes so pale they seemed almost gray, like the sky before a storm. He sat perfectly straight, his hands resting on the arms of the chair, and though his legs were still beneath a dark blanket, there was nothing weak about the way he held himself. There was only distance, a vast, cold distance, as though he were watching the entire ceremony from somewhere very far away. Their eyes met only once, briefly, as she took her place beside him. He did not smile. He did not frown. He simply looked at her, the way one might look at a piece of furniture being delivered to a house, something necessary, perhaps, but not something to be greeted. The ceremony was mercifully short. The clergyman spoke the words that bound them together, and Elena repeated her vows in a voice that did not shake, though her heart was pounding so loudly, she was certain everyone in the room could hear it. When it came time for the Duke to speak his own vows, his voice was low and even, without warmth, without hesitation, as though he were reciting a business contract, rather than promising his life to another person. And then it was done. She was his wife. There was no wedding breakfast, no gathering of friends or family to celebrate. Her father left within the hour, his obligation fulfilled, his debts, she assumed, already quietly settled. He did not embrace her before he left. He only said, "You will want for nothing here," as though that alone should be comfort enough. And then he was gone, and Elena was alone in a house full of strangers, married to a man who had not said a single word to her beyond his vows. That evening, she was shown to a private sitting room, told that His Grace wished to speak with her before dinner. She entered to find him already there, his chair positioned near the fire, a book closed on his lap, though she suspected he had not truly been reading it. "Please, sit," he said, gesturing to a chair across from him. His voice, up close, was deep and controlled, every word measured carefully before it left his mouth. Elena sat, folding her hands in her lap the way she had been taught. though nothing about this moment felt like anything she had been taught to handle. "I will speak plainly," the Duke said, "so that there is no confusion between us. This marriage exists to satisfy certain arrangements that concerned your father and myself. It is not, and will never be, a marriage born of affection. I do not require your company. I do not require your conversation. You may live in this house as comfortably as you wish, and you will want for nothing, as I understand your father has already told you. But I ask that you do not disturb me, and I will extend to you the same courtesy." Elena felt something tighten in her chest, something that was not quite hurt and not quite anger, but close to both. "I understand," she said quietly. "Good." He looked away from her, toward the fire. "Mrs. Ellery will show you the running of the house tomorrow, should you wish to involve yourself in it. Beyond that, I trust you will find ways to occupy your time." It was, she realized, a dismissal. She rose from her chair, her spine straight, refusing to let him see how much his coldness had struck her. "Thank you for your honesty, Your Grace," she said, and something in her tone must have surprised him, because for the briefest moment, his pale eyes lifted to hers again, searching, as though he had expected tears or trembling, and found neither. "Good night, Duchess," he said finally, and turned his chair away from her, toward the fire, dismissing her from his sight, as easily as he had dismissed her from his life. Elena walked back to her rooms alone, past the covered portraits and the shut doors, and when she reached her window, she looked down again, at the wild, neglected garden below, the few roses still fighting to bloom among the weeds. She did not cry that night, though she had expected to. Instead, she sat by the window for a long while, watching the rain, and made herself a quiet promise. She had not chosen this marriage, and she had not chosen this house, full of silence and grief and locked doors. But she was here now, and she would not simply fade into its shadows the way, it seemed, everyone else already had. Whatever waited for her in the days ahead, she would not disappear. Morning came gray and quiet, the same way every morning at Ravenhold seemed to arrive, as though the sun itself was reluctant to shine too brightly over the house. Elena woke early, long before Clara came to help her dress, and lay staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence pressing against the walls. She had promised herself, the night before, that she would not disappear into this house the way everyone else had. But promises made in the dark were easier than promises kept in the daylight, and now, with the whole empty day stretching ahead of her, she was not entirely certain where to begin. She began, in the end, with the garden. It was the one place in Ravenhold that had not been shut behind a locked door or draped in dust sheets, and after breakfast, which she ate alone in a dining room built for 20 guests, she pulled on her boots and walked outside into the cold morning air. The garden was worse up close than it had looked from her window. Weeds choked the paths. Ivy had crawled up the old stone wall and pulled loose several of its capstones. And yet, near the far corner, where the wall met the old glass house, a small cluster of roses still bloomed, red and stubborn against the gray morning. "You should not be out here without a coat, Your Grace." Elena turned to find an older man standing near the glass house door, a pair of shears in his weathered hands. He was tall and stooped with age, his face lined but kind, and he watched her with the same caution she had noticed in every servant at Ravenhold. "I did not know anyone still tended this garden," Elena said. "Barely tend it, if I am honest," the man said. "My name is Edmund Hale. I have kept the grounds here for 30 years, since His Grace's father's time. But there has not been much call for gardening these past 2 years. Not since—" He stopped himself, the same way Clara had stopped herself the night before. "Since the accident," Elena finished quietly. Edmund's eyebrows lifted slightly, surprised she knew. "Aye. Since then. His Grace does not come out here anymore, and without him asking for it, there did not seem much point in the work. A garden needs someone to walk through it, miss, or it starts to feel it isn't wanted at all." Elena looked around at the tangled hedges, the choked flower beds, and felt something stir in her chest, some small, determined spark. "Well," she said, "I would like it very much if you began tending it again. All of it. I will walk through it myself, if no one else will." Edmund studied her for a long moment, as though trying to decide whether she meant it. Whatever he saw in her face seemed to satisfy him, because he gave a slow nod. "I would like that, Your Grace." "Truly," I would. It was a small thing, she knew, deciding to bring a garden back to life. But it was the first decision she had made since arriving at Ravenhold that felt entirely her own, and she held on to that feeling as she walked back toward the house. Inside, she found Mrs. Ellery waiting near the entrance hall, her expression tight with something that might have been disapproval. "Your Grace," the housekeeper said carefully, "I was told you wished to be shown the running of the house today." "Yes," Elena said. "I would like that very much." Mrs. Ellery led her through room after room, reciting the duties of each department, with the flat efficiency of someone who had explained the same things many times before, to many different people. Though Elena suspected, it had been a very long while since anyone new had needed the explanation. As they walked, Elena noticed the same pattern she had seen the night before: dust sheets over furniture, closed doors, entire wings of the house that seemed to have simply stopped existing. "Why are so many rooms closed?" Elena finally asked, as they passed yet another shut door. Mrs. Ellery's steps slowed. His Grace ordered them closed. Some years back. He said there was no need to keep rooms open that no one used. "And the portraits in the hall? Why are they covered?" The housekeeper's face grew carefully blank. "That was also His Grace's order. Your Grace. If you have questions about the house's arrangements, I would suggest you ask him directly." Elena understood, then, that she would get no further answers from the staff, not because they did not know, but because they had learned, painfully, that some subjects were simply not to be touched. She thought of Clara's frightened face the night before. The way even mentioning the first Duchess's name seemed to carry a kind of danger with it. That afternoon, emboldened perhaps by her small victory in the garden, Elena decided to see more of the house herself. She wandered through the ground floor alone, trailing her fingers along dusty banisters, until she found herself outside a set of tall double doors that Mrs. Ellery had walked past without comment. Through a gap where the doors did not quite meet, she could see shelves upon shelves of books, and without truly deciding to, she found herself pushing the door open and stepping inside. The library was enormous, 3 stories of shelves rising up around a central reading area, though it too wore the same neglected look as the rest of the house. Books sat crookedly on shelves, some fallen and left where they lay. Dust floated visibly in the pale light coming through tall windows. She was halfway across the room, running her fingers along the spines of a row of forgotten novels, when a voice cut sharply through the quiet. "What are you doing in here?" Elena turned quickly to find the Duke seated near the far window, a book open on his lap, his pale eyes fixed on her with something close to alarm. She had not seen him there, tucked into the shadow of the tall shelves, and clearly, he had not expected to be found either. "I did not know this room was occupied," she said, steadying her voice. "I apologize, Your Grace. I was simply exploring the house." "This library is not part of your exploration," he said, his tone clipped, though there was something beneath the sharpness that Elena could not quite name, perhaps embarrassment, at being discovered somewhere unguarded. "I did not realize a library required an invitation," she said, before she could stop herself. His eyes narrowed slightly, and for a moment she feared she had gone too far, that she had broken whatever fragile arrangement they had agreed upon the night before. But instead of anger, something almost like surprise flickered across his face, quickly hidden again behind that same distant coldness. "You may use the library," he said finally, "as you please. I ask only that you announce yourself before entering, so that I might remove myself elsewhere." "Why?" Elena asked. "Why must you remove yourself? Surely a library is large enough for 2 people to share, without disturbing one another." "Because I prefer solitude," he said, his voice hardening, "as I explained to you last evening." "You explained that you did not wish for my company," Elena said carefully. "You did not explain why." For a long moment, he said nothing, and Elena wondered if she had finally pushed too far, if he would simply wheel himself from the room and leave her standing there among the dusty shelves. But instead, his gaze dropped briefly to the book on his lap, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its sharpness. "You ask a great many questions, Duchess." "I have a great many questions," she answered honestly. "I have arrived in a house full of closed doors and covered portraits, married to a man who will not speak more than a few sentences to me, surrounded by servants too frightened to say a word about what happened here. Forgive me if I find that difficult to simply accept without question." Something shifted in his expression then, some crack appearing briefly in that careful, controlled distance, though he covered it quickly. The staff should not be speaking to you of matters that do not concern them. They have said very little, Elena said. Mostly, they have said nothing at all, which perhaps troubles me more. The Duke was quiet for a long moment, his pale eyes fixed on some point beyond her shoulder, somewhere far away. There are things in this house, he said finally, that are better left undisturbed. I would ask that you respect that, whatever your questions.
I will respect it,
Elena said, for now. But I will not pretend I am not curious, Your Grace. I imagine you would find that difficult to believe of anyone in my position. For the first time since she had arrived at Ravenhold, something that was almost, though not quite, the ghost of a smile touched the corner of his mouth, gone as quickly as it appeared. No, he said quietly, I suppose I would not. He wheeled himself toward the door then, pausing only briefly beside her. Enjoy the library, Duchess. I will trouble you no further today. He left her standing among the books, and Elena remained there for a long while after he had gone, turning the strange, brief exchange over in her mind. There had been something beneath his coldness, she was certain of it now, something guarded and wounded rather than simply cruel. She thought of Clara's words the night before, of a man who had not left his own wing of the house in nearly 2 years, and wondered what exactly it was he was protecting himself from so carefully. That evening, as she sat alone by her window once more, she noticed something new. Down below, in the garden, a lantern had been lit near the roses, and Edmund Hale was kneeling beside the flower bed in the fading light, carefully clearing away the weeds that had choked it for so long. It was a small thing, but small things, Elena thought, were how a house slowly came back to life. And if a garden could bloom again after 2 years of neglect, perhaps other things in this house could too, given enough patience, and enough quiet, stubborn care. She did not know yet what waited for her in the weeks ahead, or whether the man she had married would ever allow himself to be reached. But as she watched the lantern light flicker among the roses below, she found herself, for the first time since arriving at Ravenhold, feeling something that was not quite hope, but stood very close to it. Weeks passed at Ravenhold in a slow, careful rhythm, and Elena began to learn the shape of her new life, the way one learns the layout of a dark room, by touch, by trial, by the occasional bruise. She rose early each day and walked the garden with Edmund, watching as bit by bit the wild hedges were tamed and the flower beds cleared of weeds. She spent her afternoons in the library, always announcing herself at the door as she had promised, though more often than not she found the room empty, the Duke having retreated elsewhere at the sound of her approach. It stung, at first, this constant avoidance. But Elena had never been the sort of person to accept a closed door without at least trying the handle, and so she persisted, quietly, patiently, refusing to let his coldness push her into the same silence that had swallowed everyone else in the house. She began speaking with the staff, not about the accident or the first Duchess, which she had learned was still forbidden ground, but about small, ordinary things. She learned that Clara had a younger brother working as a stable hand 2 counties over, whom she had not seen in over a year. She learned that Mrs. Ellery, beneath her stern exterior, had once been a talented seamstress before joining the household, and still kept a small collection of fabric scraps she could not bring herself to part with. She learned that the cook, a broad, cheerful woman named Beatrice, had been quietly experimenting with new recipes that no one in the house had eaten in years, simply because there had been no one to cook for, beyond the Duke's meager, solitary meals. He eats almost nothing, Beatrice confided one afternoon, as Elena sat in the warm kitchen, watching bread rise near the hearth. A little broth, some bread, perhaps a bit of meat if I am lucky. It breaks my heart. I remember when this house was full of guests, when His Grace's father held dinners that lasted long into the night. Now I cook for a man who barely tastes what I put in front of him. Has it always been this way? Elena asked. Even before the accident? Beatrice shook her head, wiping flour from her hands. No, miss. Before, he was different. Not loud, mind you. His Grace was never a loud man, but warm. He used to walk these halls whistling, if you can believe it. He loved this garden more than anyone, planted half those roses himself, as a young man. And her Grace Margaret, God rest her, she was the sort of woman who filled a room just by entering it. The two of them together, it was a fine thing to see. Elena absorbed this quietly, trying to picture the cold, guarded man she had met with the warmth Beatrice described, and finding it difficult to reconcile the two. "What happened to him?" Elena said carefully. "Seems to have taken more than his ability to walk." Beatrice's eyes grew sad. "Grief does that sometimes, miss. It doesn't just take what it comes for. It takes everything nearby, too, if you let it." That evening, Elena decided to test something. Rather than simply announcing herself at the library door and waiting to see if the Duke would flee, she brought a small tray of tea and 2 cups, setting it deliberately on the table nearest his usual chair, before taking a seat of her own, some distance away, a book open on her lap that she did not truly intend to read. He arrived perhaps an hour later, wheeling himself into the room with his usual quiet efficiency, and stopped abruptly when he saw her already seated there. "I did not realize you intended to remain this evening," he said, his voice carrying that familiar note of guarded surprise. "I thought perhaps we might share the room without either of us needing to flee it," Elena said lightly, gesturing to the tea tray. "I poured a cup for you as well, should you want it. If not, I will not be offended." For a long moment, he simply looked at her, and Elena wondered if he would turn and leave, as he had so many times before. But instead, after a pause that felt far longer than it likely was, he wheeled himself closer to the table and picked up the offered cup. "You are very persistent, Duchess," he said, though there was less coldness in it than usual. "I have been told that before," Elena admitted, usually as a criticism. "I did not intend it as one." He took a slow sip of the tea, his pale eyes studying her over the rim of the cup. "Though I confess, I do not entirely understand your persistence. I have given you very little reason to seek out my company." "Perhaps I am not seeking your company so much as refusing to disappear into the walls of this house," Elena said honestly. "Everyone here moves so quietly, speaks so carefully, as though the whole building might shatter if someone raised their voice or asked the wrong question. I find I cannot live that way, Your Grace. I was not raised to it, and I do not think I could learn it now even if I tried." Something flickered across his face again, that same brief crack in his composure she had glimpsed in their earlier conversations. "You think this house has taught its people to disappear. I think grief has taught this house to disappear," Elena said carefully, watching his reaction closely. "And I think everyone within these walls has simply followed the example set for them." She expected anger. She expected him to retreat again behind that cold, distant tone and dismiss her from the room. Instead, he was quiet for a long moment, his gaze dropping to the teacup in his hands. "You are more perceptive than I anticipated," he said finally, his voice quieter now, stripped of some of its usual guard. "It is true. I have not been a good example for this household. I imagine they have all learned to tread carefully around me, the way one treads carefully around something broken, afraid that any sudden movement might cause it to shatter entirely." "Are you broken, Your Grace?" Elena asked softly. He looked up at her sharply, and for a moment, she feared she had finally crossed a line she could not uncross. But instead of retreating, he set the teacup down carefully and met her eyes with something raw and unguarded that she had not seen from him before. "Yes," he said simply. "I believe I am." The admission hung in the air between them, fragile and unexpected, and Elena found she did not know quite what to say to it. Instead, she simply remained where she was, giving him the space to continue if he wished, without pressing him further. "I have not spoken of the accident to anyone in 2 years," he said, after a long silence. "Not truly. The staff know only fragments, second-hand accounts pieced together from what could not be hidden. I have never spoken the whole of it aloud, not even to myself, if I am honest." "You do not have to speak of it to me," Elena said gently. "I would not force such a thing from you." "I know," he said, and something in his voice suggested this too, surprised him. "That is, perhaps, why I find myself considering it." He did not continue that evening. The moment passed, delicate as it was, and he excused himself soon after, retreating to his own wing of the house, with a quiet good night that carried none of his earlier coldness. But Elena sat alone in the library long after he had gone, turning the exchange over in her mind, feeling as though she had, for the first time, glimpsed something real beneath the careful distance he kept from the world. The following days brought small changes that Elena noticed immediately, having grown so attentive to the rhythms of the house. The Duke did not avoid the library as often now. and though their conversations remained brief, they were no longer entirely cold. He asked, once, how the garden progressed, and seemed genuinely, if reluctantly, interested in her answer. He commented, another evening, on a book she had left open on the table, and though the exchange lasted only a few minutes, Elena found herself smiling long after he had left the room. She was careful not to push too hard, understanding instinctively that whatever wall he had built around himself had taken 2 years to construct and would not crumble easily. But she continued showing up, quietly, persistently, refusing to let the silence of the house swallow her the way it had swallowed everyone else within it. One afternoon, walking through the garden with Edmund, she noticed the old man watching her with a thoughtful expression. "You've done something to this house, Your Grace," he said, pausing his work to look at her directly. "I don't know quite what to call it, but something's different. Mrs. Ellery smiled at me yesterday, if you can believe such a thing, and His Grace, forgive me for saying so, but he doesn't look quite so much like a ghost these days." Elena felt a warmth rise in her chest at his words, though she tried not to let it show too plainly. "I have done very little, Edmund. I have only refused to be quiet. Sometimes," the old gardener said, returning to his work with a small smile of his own, "that is exactly what a house like this needs, someone who refuses to be quiet." That evening, as the sun set behind the now tamed hedges of the garden, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and rose, Elena stood at her window and allowed herself, for the first time since arriving at Ravenhold, to imagine a future in this house that was not simply one of cold silence and closed doors. She did not know yet what shape that future might take, or whether the man she had married would ever fully lower the walls he had built around himself. But something had shifted, however slightly, in the weeks since her arrival, and Elena, watching the last light fade over the garden roses below, found herself determined to see exactly how far that shift might carry them both. The fire alarm bell rang out through Ravenhold in the middle of the night, sharp and frantic, tearing Elena from sleep so suddenly that for a moment she could not understand what she was hearing. Then the smell reached her, faint but unmistakable, smoke drifting beneath her door, and she was on her feet before she had fully processed the danger. She threw open her door to find the corridor filled with a gray haze, servants running past in nightclothes, their faces pale with fear in the flickering light of the lamps someone had hurried to light. "Where is it?" she called to a passing footman, grabbing his arm. "The east wing, Your Grace," he said, his voice tight with panic. "Near the old nursery. It's spreading fast. The wood up there is old and dry." Elena's heart lurched. The east wing. She thought immediately of the Duke, of his rooms, of the fact that he could not simply run from danger the way everyone else in this house now was. "Where is His Grace?" she demanded. The footman hesitated, and that hesitation was answer enough. "His rooms are in the east wing, Your Grace, but I do not know if he has been reached yet. The smoke is thick near his corridor, and his valet has not been seen." Elena did not wait to hear the rest. She pulled her wrap tightly around her shoulders and ran, ignoring the shouts behind her, urging her toward the safety of the main staircase and the courtyard beyond. The corridor grew hotter as she went, the smoke thicker, stinging her eyes and throat, but she pressed on, one hand trailing along the wall to keep her bearings in the haze. She found the Duke's door at last, and threw it open to find him already awake, struggling against the sheets in the dim, smoke-filled room, his wheeled chair sitting uselessly several feet from the bed, knocked over in what must have been an attempt to reach it. "Elena," he said, and it was the first time he had ever used her given name, his voice sharp with something between relief and alarm. "You should not be here. Get out, now, while you still can." "I am not leaving without you," she said fiercely, already crossing the room to right the fallen chair. "There is no time for that," he said, his jaw tight with frustration. "The chair takes minutes to properly settle into, and the smoke." "Then we will not use the chair," Elena said, cutting him off. She had made her decision before she had even finished the sentence, some part of her mind clear and steady despite the panic clawing at her chest. "Put your arm around my shoulders. I am stronger than I look, and I am not leaving this room without you in it." He stared at her for one brief, disbelieving moment, and then, as the smoke thickened further and a distant crash echoed from somewhere down the corridor, he did as she asked, his arm coming heavily around her shoulders as she braced herself beneath his weight. It was not easy. He was tall, and though his legs could not support him, the rest of him was solid muscle, built from years of managing his own chair and refusing help with even the smallest tasks. Elena's knees buckled once, twice, but she gritted her teeth and pushed forward, half dragging, half carrying him toward the door, through the thickening haze of the corridor beyond. "Left," he gasped, his voice strained with effort and smoke. "The servants' stair. It is closer than the main hall." She followed his direction, stumbling through the gray darkness, her lungs burning, until at last they emerged into a narrow stairwell, where the air, though still smoky, was clearer than the corridor behind them. Servants rushed past them here too, and one, seeing their struggle, hurried forward to take some of the Duke's weight from Elena's shoulders, helping her guide him down the remaining stairs and out into the cold night air of the courtyard. They collapsed together onto the damp grass some distance from the house, both of them coughing, both of them shaking from exertion and fear, as behind them the east wing glowed orange against the night sky, servants forming a desperate line to pass buckets of water toward the flames. It took nearly 2 hours before the fire was fully contained. The damage, thankfully, limited mostly to the old, unused nursery and a section of corridor that had long stood empty. No one had been seriously harmed, though several servants bore small burns, and everyone's nerves were raw and frayed by the time the last embers were finally doused. Elena sat wrapped in a blanket near the courtyard wall, watching the smoke curl up into the lightening sky, when she became aware of the Duke's wheeled chair, hastily brought out from a storage room, settling beside her. "You should not have come for me," he said quietly, his voice still rough from the smoke. "You could have been killed." "So could you," Elena said, turning to look at him. His face was streaked with soot, his dark hair disheveled, and yet there was something in his expression she had not seen before, something raw and unguarded, stripped bare by the night's terror. "I have very little left to lose," he said, and there was no self-pity in it, only a flat, tired honesty. "You, on the other hand, have an entire life ahead of you. It was foolish to risk it for a man who cannot even properly thank you for saving it." "You do not need to thank me," Elena said, "and you are wrong, Your Grace, about having very little to lose. You have a house full of people who care for you, far more than you seem to realize." Clara nearly wept when she thought the fire had spread toward your rooms. "Edmund has not stopped pacing the courtyard since we came outside. Even Mrs. Ellery, who I do not think has shown emotion in years, has been standing near the well since the fire started, watching your window." He was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the gray light of dawn, breaking over the smoking ruins of the east wing. "You ran into a burning house for me," he said finally, as though still trying to understand it, without a single moment's hesitation. "I did not think about it," Elena admitted. "I only knew that I could not stand by and let something happen to you, not when there was even a small chance I could help." "Why?" he asked, and the question carried a weight far beyond the simple word itself. "We are near strangers, Elena. I have given you little reason to care whether I live or die." Elena considered her answer carefully, aware that whatever she said next mattered more than she could fully explain. "Perhaps," she said slowly, "I have come to care, regardless of the reasons you believe I should not." Something shifted in his pale eyes then, some wall cracking further than it ever had before, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. The silence between them filled with everything neither was quite ready to say aloud. "Thank you," he said finally, quietly, the words clearly unfamiliar and difficult for him to offer, "for coming back for me. I do not think anyone has done such a thing in a very long time." "You are my husband," Elena said simply. "Whatever else stands between us, I could not have lived with myself, leaving you behind in there." They sat together in silence after that, watching the sun rise fully over the smoking ruins of the east wing, and though neither of them spoke of it directly, something had changed between them in the chaos of that night, some careful distance finally, irrevocably breached. In the days that followed, as the household worked to clear away the damage and begin repairs, Elena noticed the Duke watching her differently, his pale eyes lingering a moment longer than they once had, his guarded coldness softened, however slightly, by whatever had passed between them in the smoke and terror of that night. She did not know yet what this shift might mean, or how far it might carry them, but she knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that the man she had married was no longer entirely a stranger to her, and that whatever remained of the wall he had built around himself, she had finally found the first true crack in its foundation. Repairs to the east wing took the better part of 2 weeks, and during that time, something in the rhythm of Ravenhold shifted in ways that Elena could feel, even before she could name them. The Duke no longer retreated at the sound of her footsteps in the corridor. He no longer excused himself from the library the moment she entered. Instead, she found him there most evenings now, a book open on his lap, a second cup of tea already poured and waiting beside his chair, as though he had come to expect her company rather than dread it. It was on one such evening, nearly 3 weeks after the fire, that he finally spoke of what had happened on the icy road 2 years before. Elena had not asked. She had learned, in the weeks since her arrival, that pressing him too directly only drove him back behind his careful walls, and so she had simply waited, patient in a way she had not known herself capable of, trusting that whatever needed to be said would come when he was ready to say it. That evening, the fire crackled low in the library hearth, and the Duke sat staring into the flames for a long while before he finally spoke. "We were returning from a dinner in the city," he said quietly, not looking at her, his voice carrying the careful, measured tone of a man reciting something he had rehearsed many times in his own mind, but never spoken aloud. "Margaret and I." It had begun to rain earlier that evening, and by the time we left, the roads had frozen over, though neither of us thought much of it. We had traveled that road 100 times before. Elena remained silent, giving him the space to continue at his own pace. "The horses lost their footing near the bend by Miller's Hollow," he continued. "I remember the carriage tilting, the sound of the wheels sliding on the ice, and then nothing but falling. We went into the ravine there, down nearly 20 feet before the carriage struck the rocks below." His hands, resting on the arms of his chair, had curled into fists, though his voice remained steady, controlled, as though sheer force of will alone kept the words coming. "I do not remember much of what followed. I am told I was pulled from the wreckage some hours later, that a farmer traveling the road at dawn heard my calls and brought help. Margaret was already gone by the time anyone reached us. The physician said she would have felt very little, that the impact was immediate. I have chosen to believe that, whether or not it is entirely true." "I am so sorry," Elena said softly, and she meant it with her whole heart, though she understood the words were far too small for what he carried. "I have told myself, every day since, that I should have insisted we wait until morning," he said, his voice finally beginning to crack, just slightly, beneath its careful control. "That I should have noticed the ice sooner, should have told the driver to slow, should have done 1,000 small things differently that might have changed everything. I was the one who suggested we leave when we did. I was the one who dismissed the driver's concern about the road." "You could not have known," Elena said gently. "I have told myself that as well," he said, "and yet it does not change the fact that she is gone, and I remain, unable even to walk from this chair to that hearth, without assistance, as though my body itself has decided to punish me for surviving, when she did not." Elena rose from her seat and crossed the small distance between them, kneeling beside his chair so that she could look up into his face, rather than down at him. "Your legs were injured in an accident that was not your fault," she said firmly. "Grief has convinced you otherwise, but grief is not always honest, Your Grace. Sometimes it simply looks for someone to blame, and finding no one else nearby, it turns that blame upon ourselves." He looked down at her then, his pale eyes glistening with unshed tears he seemed determined not to let fall. "You speak as though you understand grief intimately." "I lost my mother when I was 12, Elena said quietly. "I spent years afterward convinced that if I had simply noticed her illness sooner, insisted on calling the physician earlier, she might have lived. It took me a very long time to understand that some things happen, regardless of what we do or do not notice in time." "And did you ever fully believe that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Some days," Elena admitted honestly. "Other days, the old guilt returns, quieter than before, but never entirely gone. I do not think grief disappears so much as it learns, eventually, to sit more gently beside us." He was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the firelight, and then, slowly, almost hesitantly, he reached out and took her hand in his own, his grip firm, despite the tremor Elena could feel running beneath it. "Thank you," he said, "for not offering me easy comfort. I have had enough of empty reassurances these past 2 years. Everyone wishes to tell me it was not my fault, and yet no one has ever asked me to simply sit with the weight of it, the way you have tonight. I do not think the weight ever fully lifts, Elena said, but perhaps it need not be carried entirely alone. They remained there for a long while, his hand in hers, the fire slowly burning down to embers, and though neither of them spoke further of the accident that night, something had shifted permanently between them, some final wall finally, fully breached. In the days that followed, Elena noticed small changes in him that she had not seen before. He asked, one morning, if she would join him for breakfast, rather than eating alone, as had become their habit. He inquired after the garden's progress with genuine interest now, rather than polite distance, and one afternoon, to her surprise, he asked Edmund to wheel him out to see the roses himself. The first time, she later learned, that he had ventured beyond the house's walls in over 2 years. They are just as I remember them, he said quietly, studying the small cluster of red blooms near the old glass house. I planted these myself, you know, the summer before my father passed. I did not think I would ever wish to see them again. I am glad you came to see them, Elena said, standing beside his chair in the cool morning air. He looked up at her then, something soft and unguarded in his pale eyes. So am I, he said simply, and reached for her hand once more, holding it gently as they both looked out over the garden that was, slowly but surely, coming back to life alongside them. The weeks that followed brought a warmth to Ravenhold that Elena would not have thought possible when she first arrived through its iron gates. The Duke, whom she had begun, quietly, to think of as Alexander rather than simply his grace, joined her most evenings in the library, and their conversations no longer needed careful navigation around forbidden subjects. He spoke of his childhood in the house, of summers spent fishing in the stream beyond the eastern hedge, of his father's booming laugh that used to echo through halls now grown so quiet. Elena, in turn, found herself sharing pieces of her own life she had not spoken of in years, her mother's gentle stories before bed, the small rebellions of her own childhood, the loneliness that had crept in after her mother's death, when her father retreated into his card games and left her largely to raise herself. You have had your own grief to carry, Alexander observed one evening, as they sat together by the fire, a chessboard between them that neither of them had touched in nearly 20 minutes. And yet you arrived at this house, determined to bring life back into it, rather than adding your own sorrow to its silence. I did not see the use in adding to what was already here, Elena said, moving a pawn absently. This house had enough silence for a lifetime already. I thought perhaps it needed something else instead. You were right, he said quietly, though I confess, I did not make it easy for you to offer it. No, Elena agreed, smiling slightly, you did not. He laughed then, a real laugh, unguarded and warm, and Elena felt something bloom in her chest at the sound of it, something she had not expected to feel, for a man she had married under such cold, forced circumstances. It was around this time that Alexander first mentioned trying new treatments for his legs. Elena had read, some weeks before, of a physician in the city who had begun using new methods of gentle exercise and warm water therapy to help patients recover strength after severe injuries, and she brought the article to him one evening, uncertain how he might receive the suggestion. I have tried physicians before, he said, studying the article with a guarded expression. None of them offered much hope. This method is different, Elena said carefully. It does not promise a full recovery, only gradual improvement, built slowly over months, rather than expected overnight. I do not ask you to hope for a miracle, Alexander. Only, perhaps, to try. He was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing the edge of the article without truly reading it. You believe it could help. I believe it is worth trying, Elena said honestly. Though I understand if the thought of more physicians, more failed attempts, feels like more than you wish to bear. I have avoided it these 2 years, he admitted. Not entirely because I believed nothing would help, but because I feared the disappointment of trying and failing again. It felt safer somehow, to simply accept things as they were. Safety and living are not always the same thing, Elena said gently. He looked up at her then, something thoughtful and searching in his pale eyes. No, he agreed slowly. I do not suppose they are. He agreed, in the end. To write to the physician Elena had read of, A careful, measured letter that took him nearly an hour to compose, as though committing to even this small step required summoning courage he had not needed in a very long time. The physician, a kind, soft-spoken man named Nathaniel Bourne, arrived at Ravenhold within the fortnight, and after a thorough examination, proposed a gentle regimen of daily exercises, warm compresses, and careful, supervised attempts at standing with support. The early sessions were difficult, and more than once, Elena watched Alexander's face twist with frustration and pain as his legs, weakened by 2 years of disuse, trembled beneath even the smallest efforts. There were days he wished to give up entirely, days he grew short-tempered and withdrawn, retreating back into old habits of guarded silence. But Elena remained beside him through each session, offering steady encouragement without false promises, and slowly, gradually, small signs of progress began to appear. A slight tightening of muscle where before there had been none. A small twitch of movement in his toes that brought tears to both their eyes the first time it happened. The ability, eventually, to bear a small portion of his own weight when supported carefully between 2 attendants. "It is such a small thing," Alexander said one evening, frustration coloring his voice after a particularly difficult session. "And yet, it feels as though I am fighting a war simply to move my own foot an inch." "It is not a small thing," Elena said firmly, taking his hand in hers. "2 months ago, your legs could not move at all. Now they tremble with effort, which means the muscle beneath them still lives, still remembers how to work. That is no small victory, Alexander, whatever it might feel like in the moment." He looked at her for a long moment, something soft and grateful in his expression. "I do not know that I would have found the courage to try any of this, without you pushing me toward it. You found the courage yourself," Elena said. "I only offered the suggestion. The rest has been entirely your own effort." "Perhaps," he said, "but I do not think I would have wished to try, without someone beside me, worth trying for." The words hung between them, warmer and more direct than anything he had said to her before, and Elena felt her heart quicken at the weight of them. She did not respond immediately, uncertain how to answer such an admission, but she did not need to, because he reached for her hand then, drawing it gently to his lips in a soft, lingering kiss that told her, more clearly than words could have, exactly what he meant. It was a small gesture, quiet and unhurried, but it carried within it the full weight of everything that had shifted between them since that cold, joyless wedding in the chapel some months before. Whatever this marriage had begun as, Elena understood now, with a certainty that both thrilled and frightened her, that it had become something else entirely, something neither of them had expected, and neither of them, she suspected, now wished to lose. The summer brought with it a lightness to Ravenhold that Elena could scarcely have imagined during her first cold weeks in the house. The garden, fully restored now under Edmund's careful hand and Elena's constant attention, bloomed in full color, roses climbing the old stone wall, the hedges neatly trimmed, the paths clear and inviting where once they had been choked with weeds. Alexander joined her there most mornings now, his chair moving easily along the smooth new gravel paths that had been laid specifically to accommodate him, and more often than not, their morning walks ended with him attempting a few careful, supported steps near the old glass house, Nathaniel Bourne watching closely nearby. It was during one such morning, as Elena watched Alexander manage nearly 10 full steps with only a cane and Nathaniel's steady arm for support, that a carriage arrived unannounced at the front of the house, its fine black lacquer and gold trim immediately marking it as belonging to someone of considerable wealth and standing. Who could that be? Elena wondered aloud, watching from the garden as a tall, elegantly dressed man stepped down from the carriage. Alexander's expression, which had been bright with the small triumph of his morning's progress, darkened considerably. "That," he said, his voice tight, "is my cousin Reginald." "You do not seem pleased to see him," Elena observed. "I am not," Alexander said flatly. "Reginald is next in line to inherit the dukedom, should I die without an heir. He has visited perhaps twice in the 2 years since the accident, and both times, I confess, I found myself relieved when he left." They made their way back toward the house, Alexander managing the distance with his cane and Nathaniel's careful assistance, and found Reginald already waiting in the main hall, his sharp eyes taking in the newly opened curtains, the fresh flowers on the entrance table, the general sense of life that had returned to the once shuttered house. Alexander, Reginald said smoothly, though his eyes lingered curiously on the cane in his cousin's hand. You are looking remarkably improved, and this must be your new Duchess, I presume. Elena, Alexander said, his voice carefully controlled. May I introduce my cousin, Reginald Ashworth? A pleasure, Reginald said, bowing over Elena's hand, with a smile that did not entirely reach his eyes. I confess, I was surprised to hear of your marriage, cousin. It seemed, from all accounts, that you had quite given up on such matters. Circumstances change, Alexander said shortly. What brings you to Ravenhold, Reginald? You did not send word of your visit. Family business, Reginald said lightly, though something calculating flickered behind his easy smile. And, if I am honest, curiosity. The whole county is speaking of your remarkable recovery, cousin. Some say you were seen walking in the garden this very morning. I am undergoing treatment, Alexander said, with some small success. I do not see how that concerns you. Of course it concerns me, Reginald said smoothly. We are family, after all. Your well-being has always mattered to me. Elena watched the exchange with growing unease, sensing beneath Reginald's polished manners something far less genuine than his words suggested. He stayed for dinner that evening, charming and attentive throughout the meal, though Elena noticed his eyes lingering too often on the fine silver, the restored portraits, the general evidence of the estate's considerable wealth. It was only after Reginald departed the following morning that the whispers began, spreading through the county with the particular speed that only malicious gossip seemed to possess. By the end of the week, Elena learned from a distressed Clara that rumors were circulating in the village. Rumors that suggested the new Duchess had married Alexander purely for his fortune, that she was pushing him toward these treatments, not for his own well-being, but to secure her own position before he might otherwise consider setting her aside. It is not true, Your Grace, Clara said miserably, wringing her hands as she relayed what she had heard from the local shopkeepers. No one who truly knows you could believe such things. But the rumors are spreading regardless, and I fear Master Reginald has had a hand in encouraging them. Elena felt sick at the accusation, though she said nothing of it to Alexander at first, hoping the gossip would fade on its own. But rumors, she soon learned, rarely faded quietly, and within days, Alexander himself had heard the whispers from his own valet, arriving in the library that evening, with a thunderous expression Elena had not seen on his face in months. Is it true, he demanded, that half the county now believes you married me for nothing more than my fortune, and that you push me toward recovery only to secure your inheritance before I might change my mind about you? I have heard the rumors, Elena admitted, her voice steady, despite the hurt curling through her chest. I did not wish to trouble you with something so clearly false. False or not, it troubles me greatly that anyone would speak so of you, he said, his anger, she realized suddenly, not directed at her at all, but at whoever had spread such cruel falsehoods. I know precisely where such rumors originated, and I intend to address it directly. He requested Reginald's return to Ravenhold the following week, and when his cousin arrived, all polished smiles as before, Alexander received him in the main hall, standing now with only the support of his cane, a fact Elena suspected he had arranged quite deliberately. I have heard some troubling rumors circulating the county, Alexander said, his voice cold and controlled, in a way Elena had not heard since her earliest days at Ravenhold, concerning my wife's motives in marrying me. I understand you have been rather active in the village these past days, cousin. Reginald's smooth composure flickered, just slightly. I have heard the same rumors, Alexander, though I assure you, I have had no hand in spreading them. I find that difficult to believe, Alexander said, given that you are the only person who stands to gain from my marriage failing, or from any doubt being cast upon my wife's character. Should Elena and I separate, or should suspicion fall heavily enough upon her to sour our marriage entirely, you remain next in line to inherit everything I possess. You accuse me without proof, Reginald said, his voice growing sharper, the charm finally slipping to reveal something colder beneath. I accuse you with considerable suspicion, born of 2 years' knowledge of your character, Alexander said flatly. I will say this once, Reginald, and I trust you will remember it well. My wife's character is beyond reproach, and any further attempts to suggest otherwise, whether in this county or elsewhere, will result in consequences I do not think you will find pleasant. I have not survived what I have survived these past 2 years to allow petty scheming to threaten the one good thing that has come from it. Reginald's face had gone quite pale by the end of this speech, and whatever protest he might have offered died quickly beneath the cold certainty in his cousin's voice. He left Ravenhold within the hour, and though whispers continued in the village for a short while longer, they faded soon enough without further fuel to sustain them, replaced eventually by simple, genuine gossip about the Duke and Duchess's evident happiness, rather than any doubt about its authenticity. That evening, alone once more in the library, Elena found herself studying Alexander with something close to wonder. "You defended me rather fiercely," she said softly. "I meant every word," he said, taking her hand in his. "Elena, I do not know precisely when it happened, whether it was the night of the fire, or the evening I finally spoke of the accident, or simply the slow accumulation of every morning since, watching you bring life back into this house, and into me alongside it. But I know now, without any doubt, that what I feel for you has grown far beyond the arrangement we began with." Elena's breath caught at the raw honesty in his voice. "Alexander, I love you," he said simply, the words clearly costing him something significant to voice aloud, though his pale eyes held hers steadily as he said them. "I do not know if you feel the same, and I would understand entirely if you did not, given how this marriage began, but I could not let Reginald's poison stand unanswered. Nor could I let another day pass without telling you the truth of my own heart." "I love you too," Elena said, her voice thick with emotion she had been quietly carrying for weeks, without daring to name it aloud. "I have for some time now, Alexander, though I too was uncertain how or whether to speak of it." He drew her hand to his lips once more, and this time, when their eyes met, there was nothing guarded left between them at all, only the quiet, certain warmth of two people who had found, against every expectation, something real, growing from the coldest of beginnings. The peace that followed Alexander's confrontation with Reginald lasted only a few short weeks, before trouble found its way to Ravenhold once more. Though this time, it arrived not through whispered rumors, but through a formal letter delivered by a solicitor Elena had never seen before. She was in the garden with Alexander when the letter arrived, watching him practice his walking along the newly widened path near the roses, his steps growing steadier by the day, when Mrs. Ellery approached with visible worry etched across her usually composed face. "A letter has come for you, Your Grace," she said, handing the sealed envelope to Alexander. "From a solicitor in the city. The messenger says it concerns matters of considerable urgency." Alexander broke the seal and read quickly, his expression darkening with each passing line. "Reginald has filed a formal challenge," he said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled anger, "questioning the validity of our marriage contract, claiming that your father misrepresented certain debts in order to secure the arrangement, and suggesting that the marriage itself might therefore be declared void." Elena felt the blood drain from her face. "Can he do such a thing?" "He can attempt it," Alexander said grimly, "though I do not believe he will succeed. Still, such a challenge, even an unsuccessful one, could take months to resolve, and in the meantime, it will cast exactly the kind of doubt upon our marriage that Reginald failed to achieve through rumor alone." They traveled to the city within the week to consult with Alexander's own solicitor, a sharp, careful man named William Fairfax, who reviewed Reginald's claims with a deepening frown. "The challenge rests on a technicality regarding the original debt figures your father provided," Fairfax explained to Elena, spreading documents across his desk. "If it can be shown that your father inflated the debts to secure a more favorable arrangement from His Grace, Reginald may argue the entire contract was built upon fraudulent grounds." "My father would not do such a thing," Elena said, though even as she spoke the words, a small, uncomfortable doubt crept into her mind. She had never seen the actual figures herself. She had only been told, in broad terms, that the debts were substantial enough to threaten the family's ruin. That night, unable to sleep, Elena wrote to her father directly, demanding honesty regarding the original arrangement. His reply, when it arrived a week later, was shorter than she had hoped, but confirmed what she had feared. The debts had been real, though perhaps somewhat exaggerated in the final accounting presented to Alexander's estate, a detail her father had apparently agreed to at the suggestion of the very solicitor who had first arranged the marriage contract, a man who, Fairfax soon discovered through careful investigation, had once worked closely with Reginald himself. "It appears," Fairfax said grimly, once the connection came to light, "that this entire scheme was set in motion long before your marriage even took place. Reginald anticipated that a forced arrangement, built upon slightly inflated debts, might eventually provide him grounds to challenge the marriage's validity, should it prove necessary to remove you from his path to the dukedom." Alexander's fury at this revelation was colder and more controlled than Elena had ever seen from him, a quiet, dangerous calm that unsettled even the solicitor sitting across from them. "He has been planning this for over a year," he said slowly, "long before Elena and I ever exchanged our first words." "What can we do?" Elena asked, fear tightening in her chest, at the thought of losing everything they had built together over these past months. "We fight it," Alexander said firmly, taking her hand in his. "Whatever the original figures, Elena, our marriage was legally entered into by both willing parties, and no amount of technical maneuvering will change what has grown between us since. Fairfax will handle the legal challenge. I have full confidence in his ability to expose Reginald's scheme for exactly what it is." The following months brought a slow, grinding legal battle that tested both their patience and their resolve, though through it all, Elena found comfort in the fact that Alexander never once wavered in his certainty regarding their marriage, nor in his determination to protect what they had built together. Fairfax proved every bit as capable as promised, uncovering correspondence between Reginald and the original solicitor that clearly demonstrated premeditated scheming rather than any genuine concern for fairness in the marriage contract. The case was ultimately dismissed by the county magistrate, who found Reginald's challenge to be exactly the malicious, self-serving attempt it truly was. Reginald himself, facing considerable embarrassment and the threat of further legal consequences for his scheming, quietly withdrew from society for a time, his reputation considerably damaged by the whole sordid affair. "It is finally over," Elena said, relief washing through her as they received the final confirmation of the case's dismissal. "It is," Alexander agreed, drawing her close. "And I confess, Elena, that through all of it, watching you stand beside me through every difficult moment, I have never once doubted the strength of what we share, whatever schemes Reginald might concoct against it." "Nor have I," Elena said softly, resting her head against his shoulder as they sat together in the library that had become, over these past months, the true heart of their shared life at Ravenhold. With the legal troubles finally behind them, Alexander threw himself into his recovery with renewed determination, as though the fight to protect his marriage had reminded him of exactly how much he now had to live for. Nathaniel Bourne, pleased with the steady progress made over the preceding months, began introducing more challenging exercises, and though the work remained difficult, painful some days beyond what Elena could bear to watch without her own eyes stinging with sympathetic tears, Alexander pushed forward with a stubborn resolve that reminded her, more and more, of the warm, determined man Beatrice had once described from years before the accident. "I want to walk without the cane," he told Elena one morning, as they sat together in the garden, watching the early autumn light filter through the trees. "Not perfectly, perhaps not for great distances, but I want to feel my own legs carry me again, even if only across this garden." "That is a wonderful goal," Elena said, squeezing his hand encouragingly. "I want to walk to you," he continued, his pale eyes meeting hers with quiet intensity. "Without support, without assistance, simply on my own two legs, the way any husband might cross a room to reach his wife. I have thought of little else these past weeks." The work toward this goal proved slow and often frustrating. There were mornings Alexander's legs trembled so badly beneath him that he required both Nathaniel and Elena's support simply to remain upright. Mornings he grew short-tempered with his own body's limitations, retreating briefly into old patterns of guarded frustration, before catching himself and pushing forward once more. But bit by bit, week by week, his strength grew, the trembling lessened. The distance he could manage with only a single hand resting lightly on Elena's arm grew longer with each passing session, until one crisp October morning, nearly a year after Elena had first arrived at Ravenhold as a frightened, reluctant bride, Alexander stood at one end of the garden path, Nathaniel and Elena watching carefully from a short distance away, and took his first unassisted steps in over 2 years. They were slow, careful steps, his balance uncertain, his legs clearly still weak beneath him, but they were entirely his own. No cane, no supporting arm, nothing but sheer determination, and months of patient, painful effort carrying him forward one step at a time. Elena watched, tears streaming freely down her face, as he crossed nearly 10 feet of garden path entirely unaided, finally reaching her and gathering her into his arms with a strength that nearly knocked them both off balance, laughing and crying together in equal measure at the sheer impossible wonder of it. "You did it," Elena said, her voice breaking with emotion as she held him close. "Alexander, you truly did it." "We did it," he corrected gently, pulling back just enough to look into her eyes. "I could not have found the courage to try, let alone the strength to succeed, without you beside me, every single day, Elena. This victory belongs to both of us equally." Nathaniel, watching from a respectful distance, wiped his own eyes discreetly, before approaching to offer his congratulations. "Remarkable progress, Your Grace, truly remarkable. I have rarely seen such determination in a patient, nor such devoted support from a spouse. The two of you together have accomplished something I confess I did not fully believe possible when we began this treatment nearly 6 months ago." News of Alexander's recovery spread quickly through the county, this time carrying none of the malicious undertones Reginald had once attempted to attach to their story. Instead, the whispers now spoke only of wonder, of a duke who had been given up for lost by half the physicians in the region, restored to walking through nothing more than patience, determination, and the steady devotion of the wife he had once married under such cold, unwilling circumstances. That evening, as they sat together by the library fire, Alexander drew Elena close, resting his chin gently atop her head as they watched the flames dance in comfortable silence. "I have been thinking," he said finally, "of everything that has changed since you first arrived at this house. I remember watching you from across the chapel on our wedding day, certain I would never feel anything for you beyond polite, distant obligation. I could not have imagined, that cold gray morning, how thoroughly you would come to fill every corner of my life since." "Nor could I," Elena admitted softly. "I arrived here frightened and resentful, prepared to endure a marriage I believed would bring me nothing but loneliness. I never imagined I would find such genuine happiness within these walls, Alexander, nor such profound love for the man I found waiting for me here." He kissed her then, slow and tender, filled with everything they had built together over these past months. Every difficult conversation, every quiet victory, every moment of vulnerability, shared between two people who had begun as reluctant strangers, and become, against every expectation, each other's truest companions. "I would like to hold a celebration," Alexander said, once they finally parted. "Not simply for my recovery, though that alone would be reason enough, but for us, Elena. For this marriage that began in such cold circumstances and has grown into something I treasure beyond measure. I want the whole county to see exactly what we have built together." "I would like that very much," Elena said, smiling against his shoulder, already imagining the warm glow of candlelight, the sound of music filling halls that had stood silent for far too long, and the quiet, certain joy of standing beside the man she loved, in the house that had somehow, slowly and surely, become truly their home. The great hall of Ravenhold had not seen a proper gathering in over 2 years, and as Elena stood at the top of the grand staircase on the evening of the celebration, watching servants put the final touches on tables laden with Beatrice's finest cooking, candles blazing warmly along every wall, she found it difficult to reconcile this bright, welcoming scene with the cold, shuttered house she had first arrived at, so many months before. Flowers from the restored garden filled every corner of the hall, roses and late autumn blooms, arranged carefully by Edmund himself, who had insisted on personally selecting every stem for the occasion. Musicians tuned their instruments near the far wall, and outside, carriages were already beginning to arrive, carrying guests, eager to witness firsthand the remarkable transformation that had taken hold of Ravenhold and its once reclusive duke. Elena wore a gown of deep blue silk, chosen carefully for the occasion, and as she descended the staircase, she caught sight of Alexander waiting at the bottom, standing tall and unaided, his cane resting nearby should he need it, though his posture carried none of the guarded uncertainty she remembered from their very first meeting in the chapel so long ago. "You look radiant," he said, taking her hand as she reached the final step, his pale eyes warm with an open admiration he no longer troubled himself to hide. "You look happy," Elena said softly, studying the easy warmth in his expression, so different from the cold, distant stranger who had once dismissed her from his presence within hours of their wedding. "I am happy," he said simply, "more than I ever believed possible again." The evening unfolded in a warm blur of music and conversation, guests from across the county, mingling freely, through halls that had stood empty and dark for so long, marveling openly at the transformation that had overtaken both the house and its master. Reginald, Elena noticed, was conspicuously absent from the guest list, his reputation still recovering from the scandal of his failed legal challenge, though few seemed to miss his presence at all. Partway through the evening, as the musicians paused between sets, Alexander rose from his seat near the head table and, with only the faintest hint of nervousness, requested the attention of the assembled guests. "I know many of you have wondered," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the now quiet hall, "what has brought about the changes you see here tonight? Some of you knew me before the accident that claimed my first wife, and very nearly claimed my ability to walk alongside her. Others have only known the reclusive, difficult man I became in the years that followed, shuttered away in this house, convinced that nothing good remained for me beyond simple survival." He paused, his eyes finding Elena's across the room, and something in his expression softened further still. "I did not expect, when I agreed to a marriage arranged out of necessity rather than affection, that I would find in my wife not merely a companion, but the very reason I found the courage to fight for my own recovery, the reason this house has come back to life after 2 years of grief and silence, the reason I stand before you all tonight on my own 2 legs, having very nearly given up hope of ever doing so again." Murmurs of warm approval rippled through the assembled guests, and Elena felt tears prickling at her eyes as Alexander continued, crossing the room now, unaided, to stand directly before her. "Elena," he said, taking both her hands in his, "you arrived at my door a stranger, forced into a marriage neither of us chose, and you left me with no choice but to fall completely and irrevocably in love with you, through nothing more than your patience, your courage, and your refusal to let either myself or this house disappear into the silence I had built around us. I do not believe I could adequately thank you for what you have given me, beyond simply promising you every day of devotion I have left to offer." The hall erupted into warm applause as Alexander drew her into an embrace, and Elena, laughing through her own happy tears, felt entirely, completely at home, for the first time since she had first passed through the iron gates of Ravenhold so many months before. Later that evening, as the celebration wound down and guests began their departures, Elena and Alexander walked together through the quiet garden, the autumn air cool and crisp around them, the last of the season's roses still clinging stubbornly to their blooms near the old stone wall. "I never imagined," Elena said softly, leaning against him as they walked, "that a marriage born of such coldness and obligation could grow into something so full of genuine warmth and love." "Nor did I," Alexander admitted, his arms settling comfortably around her shoulders. "I believed my capacity for happiness had been buried, along with Margaret, that grief alone would define the remainder of my days. You proved me wrong, in every possible way, Elena, and I will spend the rest of my life grateful that you refused to let me remain lost in that darkness." They paused near the old glass house, where the very first roses Elena had discovered on her first cold morning at Ravenhold still bloomed, red and stubborn against the gathering dusk. "Whatever challenges still wait for us ahead," Alexander said quietly, "Reginald's schemes, the slow work of my continued recovery, whatever else life might yet bring, I know now that I face them with a partner beside me who has already proven, time and again, that she will not abandon me to face them alone." "Never," Elena promised, turning to meet his eyes in the soft evening light. "Whatever comes, Alexander, we face it together, exactly as we have faced everything since that first frightened morning I arrived at your gates." He kissed her then, gently, beneath the last blooming roses of autumn, and Elena, standing in the garden she had helped bring back to life, alongside the man she had once feared she could never learn to love, understood with quiet certainty that whatever the future held, she had found. In this house and in this marriage, neither of them had chosen something rarer and more precious than either of them could ever have imagined on that cold, joyless wedding day so many months before. She had found a true and lasting love, grown patiently from the coldest of beginnings, strong enough now to weather anything the years ahead might bring.